Welcome back to Face the Nation. We continue our conversation now with former FBI agent, now Congressman Brian Fitzpatrick of Pennsylvania. Congressman, Breitbart, a conservative website, published the names of the FBI agents who went to Mar-a-Lago and are related to that. And there are now a spike in online threats against them. I want to play for you how some Republican Party leaders have described events this week.
The FBI raid of President Trump is a complete abuse and overreach of its authority.
We're very strong supporters of law enforcement, and it concerns everybody if you see some agents go rogue and if you see an agency that doesn't have the right checks and balances at the top.
Is that responsible to refer to these law enforcement officials as going rogue?
Yeah, I think, Margaret, and I've urged all my colleagues to make sure they understand the weight of their words and understanding what we don't know yet. And that's why that probable cause affidavit is so important. And the unfortunate reality, Margaret, I mean, in my few short years in Congress, I've seen undermining of all three branches of government lead to threats of violence and acts of violence, starting with the attack on my fellow baseball team members on the baseball field, to threats to Supreme Court justices, to threats to law enforcement, both local and during the unrest in the summer of 2020, and now to federal law enforcement. All of it's unacceptable.
Right, and now there's a bulletin warning law enforcement of the level of threat right now. That's why I want to ask you, overnight, a series of statements from the 45th president saying the FBI has a long and unrelenting history of being corrupt. He said the FBI is a criminal RICO enterprise whose cover sources and methods include criminal acts. His campaign is fundraising off of this and has referred to an army of agents from the FBI breaking into his home and said that he hopes they're not planting evidence. Is he putting a target on the back of these FBI agents?
I checked in with several of my colleagues in the past few days, Margaret, to make sure they were okay. Every single elected official, every single leader needs to mind the weight of their words.
Including the former president of the United States, who has not called for calm.
Correct. I think everybody needs to be calling for calm, everybody across the board. And everybody needs to respect our law enforcement, whether they be local, state, or federal. I'm very concerned, Margaret, for the safety of our law enforcement officers, especially right now. I myself have been notified by the Bureau that my life was put in danger recently by some of these same people. And violence is never the answer to anything. We live in a democracy that's 246 years old. Margaret, that's not long, that's just a few generations, and yet we're the world's oldest democracy. And the only way that can come unraveled is if we have disrespect for our institutions that lead to Americans turning on American, and the whole system becomes unraveled. And a lot of that starts with the words we're using. So I urge all my colleagues, and we've seen disrespect across the political spectrum, Margaret, which I mentioned with local law enforcement, with the Supreme Court, and now federal law enforcement. None of it is okay. None of it.
If you take the name Donald Trump off of this warrant, are you okay with this raid?
It shouldn't matter. No one is above the law. That's a principle that all of us should agree to. But all I'm saying here, Margaret, is an unprecedented action because this will have an impact on other things. For example, a lot of us are trying very hardly to get FISA and Section 702 reauthorized. This is, potentially, if this were a warrant that was excessive, and we don't know whether it was or not, because, Margaret, there's a continuum of ways to gather evidence, everything from the passive service of a subpoena with a future production date to the dynamic execution of a search warrant, which we saw here. There's a lot of things you can do in between, including a forthwith subpoena where you present that subpoena at the door, you don't enter the premises, but you demand instant production then and there. We don't know what was appropriate, what was justified or not, and that's why this affidavit is so important. That will answer all the questions. So I'm urging all my colleagues, don't prejudge what we don't know about yet. And I'm also urging all my colleagues to understand the weight of your words and support law enforcement no matter what.
Thank you very much, Congressman Fitzpatrick. And on Saturday, the Biden administration released an updated assessment on al-Qaeda in Afghanistan, citing intelligence community reports that the terror group is no longer assessed to be a threat in that country. Tomorrow marks 1 year since the chaotic collapse of the Afghan government as U.S. troops prepared to leave. And while the administration's full report on the much criticized withdrawal is still a work in progress, the top Republican of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, Michael McCaul's report, is complete. He's here with us. Good morning to you, Congressman.
Thanks, Margaret. Thanks for having me.
This deserves a full conversation, and I want to get to it. Let me do this bit of business, though, first on the events of the past few days. Senator Marco Rubio, who's the vice chair of Senate Intelligence, issued a letter saying he was outraged not to have been briefed, and he blasted the FBI, saying that they have done more damage to faith in the rule of law than the Russian Federation or any other foreign adversary. Is his anger misplaced?
You know, I think it comes on the heel. I think the Wall Street Journal did a great article about how, after the Russian collusion, Steele dossier, everything that took place during the Trump presidency and now out of office to have this raid take place. Look, I'm a DOJ alumni. I worked at Public Integrity here at Maine Justice. And what I worry about, Margaret, is the lack of trust and faith in our institutions. That concerns me most above all. And I think when you saw the DHS bulletin about, potential threats now to the agents, this is the whole fabric of our democracy. And they have lost faith. Many have in the FBI and our institutions. I hate to see that as a former federal prosecutor.
Understood. And there is something like a healthy skepticism about law enforcement, certainly, but for the former president to be using the language that he is when there is this level of threat against FBI agents, would you call on him to tone it down?
I think it's inflammatory. I don't want to put any law enforcement in the bullseye of a potential threat. I'm someone who's worked with law enforcement most of my career. This is an extraordinary case. And what lawyers, we call a case of first impression. We've never had a former president of the United States serve with a search warrant. There was a subpoena. The court could have enforced the subpoena. That should have been a last stage process. And I agree with Brian Fitzpatrick, right? Mm-hmm. The affidavit in support of the warrant will give you the probable cause to try to understand what is going on here. And I think the American people deserve this. And I certainly think, to Rubio's point, that the Gang of Eight should have been briefed, and I believe that the relevant committees on the Hill should have access to the documents, but most importantly, this affidavit.
Yeah. Well, we will see. It sounds like it may take some time to get some of these answers. I want to talk to you about Afghanistan. I've read your report. The State Department says there are about 74,000 vulnerable Afghans still stuck waiting for these visas to exit the country who worked with the United States government. Your report says the State Department knew going back well into the Trump administration that it needed more staff, that it needed more resources to even begin to help get these people out. And that's before the chaos of the withdrawal. Mm-hmm. Is that one of the prime sort of sins here that you see in terms of failure to plan? There
are many sins, if you will. There was a complete lack and a failure to plan. There was no plan, and there was no plan executed. And to your point, even beforehand, I think the State Department probably didn't have the resources it needed to carry out an evacuation of this size and enormity. They had 36 consular officers at HKIA trying to process hundreds of thousands of people. They were overwhelmed, but there are so many mistakes. The biggest one, Margaret, for me, having lived through it, being in the classified space, listening to the intelligence community tell the story about this is going to be imminent. It's going to fall sooner rather than later. The military told us the same thing. And then we went to state, and they paint in the White House a very rosy picture. There's a disconnect between intelligence on the ground and what the White House is doing. I think in this report, this says it all. Like, there's no way we're going to evacuate embassy personnel from helicopters like we did in Vietnam. Yeah. And of course, we know that happened.
Well, the criticism of this report will be that this was the minority report, that it's inherently political. And that when the Republicans take the majority, if they win the majority in November, that this is going to be just a political line of attack. How do you respond to that?
I was a federal prosecutor longer than a member of Congress, so it's been almost 20 years now. And I pride myself as being objective. I think this is a fairly objective report about the failures that were made. You know, one of the biggest ones was that the Taliban, sitting with his al-Qalis out of the special envoy, and General McKenzie, the CENTCOM commander, made an offer. You can take control over Kabul and secure it for purposes of the evacuation.
And General McKenzie said, that's not my assignment here.
Not my assignment. That's not what the commander-in-chief told me. They do run it up to the White House, and they get no response. And then later, Jen Psaki says they wouldn't have approved that. Think about what that would have changed. We had to rely on the Taliban to secure the perimeter of HKIA. That led to the chaos. It also led to the suicide bomber that killed 13 service members, men and women, and injured over hundreds of people. And it could have been avoided.
You know, the current U.S. Special Envoy for Afghan women and girls was out of government when this was going on. She's quoted in your report as saying she still struggles to understand how this supposedly pre-planned, negotiated, inevitable withdrawal ended the way it did. It feels so much like living Schindler's List. That's a pretty powerful criticism. Who specifically needs to be held accountable, if anyone here? And is it simply just the matter of this was an intelligence failure, that the government would fall as quickly as it did, that the former president would have fled? How do you respond to that, that there was an inability to plan for this because it was not predicted?
Well, the intelligence community got it right. So there's no failure on the intelligence side, nor the Pentagon. They called it right. The problem was the White House and State Department putting their head in the sand, not wanting to believe what they were saying, and therefore not adequately planning. And I think to your point, the women left behind is the worst of this entire story. I tried. Yes. I got 4 busloads of little girls from a music school out, but the Schindler's List, you know, if you're on the list, you're going to live. If you're not on the list, you're probably going to die. 100,000 Afghan partners left behind. Remember, we said we will protect you. That was our promise to them. No one left behind, and we left them behind to the mercy of the Taliban, and now they're being tortured and killed.
Well, the State Department says that it has tried to comply with your committee. We await their full report of their own actions. Thank you for sharing your findings today.
They have not complied with our investigation at all.
Congressman, thank you for your time today. We turn to Imtiaz Tyab, who reports from Kabul about how life for the people of Afghanistan has taken a turn for the worse under the Taliban.
1 year after the Taliban's lightning-fast takeover of Afghanistan, and the group's grip on power is tighter now more than ever.
Across Kabul, you can see the Taliban's flag flying nearly everywhere, making it clear the U.S.-backed Republic of Afghanistan is gone, and the Taliban's Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan is holding strong.
But the nation's economy is in ruins. Following the Taliban takeover, the U.S. froze billions in assets, and foreign donors pulled funding that made up nearly 3/4 of Afghanistan's annual budget, triggering what the UN calls the worst humanitarian crisis in the world, where around 90% of people don't have enough food to eat. And yet, the emirate seems more focused on controlling the lives of its citizens, especially women, who have seen so much of the progress they've made over the past 20 years disappear and have been told to cover up. High school-age girls have also largely been shut out of classrooms for the past year, but a growing number are defying the Taliban by going to unofficial schools like this one, including Nafisa, whose own brother is a Taliban. My brother doesn't know that I come to this school, she says. It's only my mother who supports me. For world leaders, how to engage with the Taliban government continues to be a challenge. Many of the men now running Afghanistan remain on international terrorist lists, some with multi-million-dollar bounties on their head, like acting Interior Minister Sirajuddin Haqqani, who is linked to this house in Kabul, where the U.S. says Ayman al-Zawahiri, the al-Qaeda leader and 9/11 plotter, was killed earlier this month in a drone strike. Abdul Qahar Balki is the Taliban spokesman for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs.
So far, we haven't reached a conclusion that indeed Mr. Zawahiri was present in Kabul.
To be clear, you're not confirming that Ayman al-Zawahiri was killed in that house not far from where we're sitting now?
Absolutely. We have not arrived at that conclusion.
Abdulqahar Balki, however, did agree that if the leader of a terrorist organization like Al-Qaeda was found living in Afghanistan, the Taliban would consider it a violation of the nation's sovereignty. Margaret.
MTS Tyab reporting from Kabul. We'll be right back. We are also nearing another milestone. It's been almost 6 months since Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and the war is entering a dramatic new phase. Our Charlie D'Agata reports from the southeastern region of Ukraine.
Ukraine's artillery and missile barrages this week continue to exact a heavy toll on Russian forces. Yet nearly 6 months into the invasion, the offensive grinds on. Ukrainian territory, towns, cities we visited in eastern Donbass region back in April is now firmly under Russian occupation. But this week, the war entered a dramatic new phase in the south, and the series of explosions at the Russian airbase in Crimea is just one part of it. It comes as Ukrainian forces prepare for a major counterattack to recapture Kherson province. In a frontline position we're not allowed to identify, combat medic Serhiy Zaitsev said he's seen horrific injuries as the Russians have stepped up shelling. The Ukrainian counteroffensive is already underway, he says, yesterday, today, tomorrow, and that hit on the airfield in Crimea is a clear statement to Russians that we can get you. And the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant sits on the very edge of the front line, under Russian control since the early days of the war. It's now become a battleground, with Ukraine accusing Russian forces of using it as a shield to launch attacks. Yesterday, we visited the towns of Marhanets and Nikopol, just across the river from the plant, which have come under heavy nightly bombardment. This is just one apartment destroyed in the bombardment. Residents here tell us they only have about 7 seconds from the time of launch at the nuclear power plant to impact. No time for an air raid siren, no time to take shelter. Deputy Mayor of Nikopol, Natalia Horbalit, told us shells start raining down in the early hours. Do you believe that these attacks are coming from the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant? At that range, the maximum is around 10 miles from us. G7 nations have called on Moscow to withdraw its forces in order to avoid a nuclear catastrophe. But nobody is giving ground here as both sides double down for the battle to come.
Charlie, thank you. We'll be back in a moment. It's back to school time, and districts nationwide are dealing with a serious teacher shortage. But it's hard to know exactly how many classrooms are teacher-less due to gaps in data from state to state. Alberto Carvalho is the superintendent of the second largest school district in the country, Los Angeles, and he joins us this morning. Good morning to you. The Bureau of Labor Statistics says there are 300,000 fewer public school teachers than there were before the pandemic. These were numbers current in June. Do you know why so many teachers are leaving the classroom?
Well, good morning. Number one, I believe we do. Number one, there are economic conditions that have made it difficult for teachers to be recruited into the classroom. Insufficient pay, critical hardship. The pandemic did not help. Certainly the over 2 years that teachers endured during virtual learning and then back to school with extreme conditions faced by many certainly had a chilling effect on many. And as a result of that, a disproportionate number of teachers across the country decided to retire before accruing full benefits. That's truly unprecedented in America's history.
Well, a member of your staff told us that out in LA, to mitigate the shortage, you're giving out incentives, grants, but also something called alternative certification programs where teachers can go into the classroom before they've fully completed their own credentialing and their field work. You've also hired instructors on provision and intern permits. That sounds like you're lowering standards.
We're really not. I mean, these are fully credentialed individuals. They have a bachelor's or a master's degree. They may not yet have the state certification, but they have the course content already done. They may be missing a specific exam. But look, we are, for the very first time in over a decade, fully staffed going into August 15th, the very first day of school. We were able to hire in excess of 1,500 teachers during the summer months. We partnered with colleges and universities. We cast a wide net for recruitment. We offered incentives. And last but not least, we, as you correctly said, embraced this concept of micro-credentialing to accelerate the hiring of qualified teachers for our students.
The average pay, according to the National Education Association in your district for a teacher, is $87,000. Is the issue really pay? And given at the federal level that so much emergency funding has been pumped in, I think it's $2.5 billion just from that spring rescue package, why isn't the incentive enough to solve this problem on a national scale?
Well, number one, the incentives are positive. However, you need to have a pipeline of eligible candidates to fill these positions. And what we've seen is, number one, there are insufficient candidates graduating from colleges of education nationally, particularly teachers with a certification with students with disabilities, elementary age students as well. So the pay is important, working conditions are important, health benefits packages are important. I can tell you one thing, considering the cost of living in Los Angeles, considering the cost of housing in Los Angeles, it is difficult to recruit individuals into our community. Nonetheless, for the very first time in over a decade, every single student in every single classroom in Los Angeles Unified will have a credentialed teacher on day one. That's truly stunning.
About 10 to 20,000 students, you've said, are not enrolled in school or have stopped attending. Where are these kids going?
Well, that's been the question that the country has been asking. We know as a result of the pandemic, many parents decided not to enroll kids, particularly youngest kids, kindergarten and pre-K kids in schools. Secondly, in communities like Los Angeles or Miami, where you have a significant percentage of students who are immigrants or children of immigrants, as a result of the pandemic and worsening economic conditions, they may have left the community or the country. So we have the lost children of Los Angeles. There are lost children in Miami, New York, every single large urban center. That is why this past week we scoured the community, we did knocks on doors, and we are bringing kids back into our school system.
It's an important story, Superintendent. We will stay on it. Thank you. We'll be right back. That's it for us today. Thank you for watching. Until next week, I'm Margaret Brennan.